That clock is not a good
Oh,
clock.
good. I was looking at that clock, but it didn't
No.
seem to be moving very much, right?
Oh, it's moving
Yeah,
slow. That's the key, the scary part of it. Okay, so without much ado, let me welcome our first sonic speaker for the spring quarter. Ideally, and very well timed to be on the very first day of the spring quarter year. Corinne is the Lewis Progressive Chair? Fellow.
Mm-hmm.
And also chair of the Faculty Council at the Weatherhead School at Case Western, and has a very diverse background, an undergraduate in, was it
American culture.
American culture,
Yeah.
which prepared her well to get an MBA from Chicago and a PhD from Michigan. Works in a lot of areas that intersect with several of the folks in this room, including a lot of work in looking at teams and groups and looking at agent-based models in particular. Has published in places like Org Science and OVHTP and computational mathematical org theory and so on. And these are journals that are familiar to us and ones that we read. And I'm really happy that after talking to Corinne about coming and visiting us forever, we finally have a chance to have a visit here, etc. And so I'm looking forward to the talk, and thanks again for coming. So.
Well, thank you for having me, Nash. Thank you. So, because I've known Nash for a while, and it's funny because I sort of recently, you weren't in a business school, because I was trained at a business school, right? But Nash is so widely read, so widely published and so widely read, right, that we all think we own him and he's in our field. Yeah, but it may also be because I'm at that fringe of, I have, of course, I said an MBA back in my corporate days, and then came back and got a PhD from Michigan in business administration. But I'm also in a certain fringe group, right, which is, I got hooked into complex systems research and agent-based modeling some time ago. And I came there from corporate life. I came there with an interest in studying teamwork, group dynamics, and it took me a couple years of taking lots of stats classes, right, before I realized that absolutely none of them helped me study what I wanted to study, because I was interested in interdependence. And I was fortunate, I was on the campus of the University of Michigan at the time, where they were starting what they called the Program for the Study of Complex Systems, which is now the Center for the Study of Complex Systems. So, and I tell you this because I think the roots of my talk are in this training, because I was trained in a group of people who were physicists, mathematicians, political scientists, epidemiologists, sociologists, right? And obviously at the time a token person from the business school community. But we were all struggling with this problem of interdependence. So I got, I think, very fundamental training in the study of complex systems. I don't think there is something called complexity theory, just for the record, and that shows up in other people's writings. And then I became an agent-based modeler. Having never written a line of code in my life, and about the fourth year of my doctoral program, I decided I had to learn how and I had to do this. And I would also say that many of the roots of my understanding about emergence and the process of emergence come from that hands-on experience, right? I build models, I know what's involved. And I feel like this is sort of my coming out, because I've been sort of quietly building agent-based models and publishing them, and a little bit lonely in organizational behavior, not many folks doing this kind of work. But recently, more and more people in org studies and in organizational behavior have become really, really interested in this approach to studying group dynamics and interdependence and lots of issues, okay? And more they're irritating me, right? Because I think they don't know what they're talking about, and it bothers me immensely. And so I put together at least the beginnings of this paper on emergence, which I call the New Foundations. And you'll see why this is in response to a sort of a movement about finding the micro-foundations of strategy, or that's at least where I started. So let me jump into this, and I will try to move along, because I probably could take longer than an hour to talk, and I've got lots of ideas, and I would like a little bit of time for us to engage about them. So I'm going to kind of move rapidly through my slides. But this is what I would say is people are really trying to make connections, especially in the organization studies field. People studying or firm level work, and people studying teams, and people studying individuals are trying to make connections, right? So we have people at firm talk about firm capabilities, and they want to explain them in terms of routines. People studying routines or teamwork or leadership, all trying to talk about them in terms of people's actions in terms of cognitions and emotion, and people actually starting to get into brain functions, okay? Yet we're struggling because we don't really know how to do that, right? And all we have is this sort of blunt weapon of correlations, right? Is there some correlation between what people think and what people do? Although you will also, I mean, I laid this out really nicely. There are also people trying to explain this in terms of brain functions. There's lots of skipping levels and other confusions going on, okay? In strategy, which is not my area, but it started sounding like my area, there's been this call for a return to, they call it microfoundations. There's this big debate, it's been going on in the literature for about 10 years now. And it started, and the idea is we won't understand routines very well in firms, and if we could just go back to the people doing them, that it all would become clear. And so in 2005, these guys, Phelan and Foss, who really started or stirred up this conversation about microfoundations, said, to fully explicate anything, and you got to appreciate that, anything, right? One must fundamentally begin with and understand the individuals that compose the whole, especially their underlying nature, choices, ability, propensities, heterogeneity, purposes, expectations, and motives. Okay, and this was their first call to action. And they said the problem with the way org strategy studies things like routines and capabilities, these higher level things, is they're committed to methodological collectivism and ignoring methodological individualism. And they actually went further and said there is no such thing as collectivism. There is only individualism. And I'll tell you, well, they've kind of gotten their butts kicked, okay, since then for these kind of claims. But they started out there with a really strong desire to understand routines in this more basic function. But even a few years later, I said, having been kicked around a little bit, they started to elaborate and said, well, okay, maybe we'll allow that there are some collective things, but to unpack them, we need to look at individual level factors. Although now they're starting to say the interaction of individuals leading to emergent, collective, and organizational level outcomes, and something about how relations between micro variables are mediated by what happens at the micro level. And I point out mediated because I want you to see that there's a language of variance here, which I will suggest to you is actually really problematic. Okay? But there are kind of now moving to this idea of like, there's something about emergence and interactions and some stuff there we need to understand. Okay, but they got pushed back a lot, right? You see, Sid Winter said immediately said, like basically, of course we want individuals, but it's so expansive and permissive. I mean, who could object, right? Of course there are people involved in this some way, but what is it that you want to do to connect them? Then they really got pushed around because, like, why stop with individuals? I mean, why is that the stopping point? Or their attitudes, or their, this whole list of possible things, why stop there? And some people said, why stop there? And people said, why not stop somewhere above the individual, right? But it's a problem of reductionism, right? Is why reduce to that level, and what level should we reduce to? And by the way, Phelan and Foss came back with an answer. Well, actually, it was J. Barney and Phelan. You should recognize the name. J. Barney's rather an important person, but they wrote, well, because it's a natural stopping point. Okay, not a very technical argument, right? So we can see that we're kind of confused, and there's lots of haziness about this. And then there are a few folks who came back and said, well, why just human psychology? That's not enough. You need to look at structured relationships between people. You need to look at structures and technology in the world. And you'll see people here who know something about routines, right? And finally, Sid Winter said in one of his more recent papers is we really need to clarify the connections between the units and the levels of analysis here, right? That it's all very, very, said we agree that individuals matter, but how exactly do they connect? What do we do about it? So, people say this. There's basically, Barney and Phelan said, emergence should take center stage. But I should tell you in the same article when I thought, oh, well, then they've answered my question. I don't need to say anything. Emergence should take center stage because I agree. But if you read that article, it says emergence should take center stage. But the individuals are the most important part. We should focus on the individuals. And my reaction was, you can't have it both ways, because those aren't the same claims. Okay, now at the same time, team scholars are also kind of working around these issues of emergence and trying to understand them. Team scholars have noted really for some time that the study of group dynamics is mostly a study of group statics. And if you've read much of the literature, you see that the push to become more legitimate by using statistics also meant that we had to pull away from people being interdependent and interacting with one another. So you have all kinds of studies, certainly from the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, where what we pretty much do is we look at the effect of the group on the person, right? We have to control away the group so that we have independent observations, which are necessary to make our statistical claims, right? And there are some, probably the most impressive studies in groups don't work like that, but the majority of studies still look like that, where we're isolating the actions of individuals. Or, as you know, the other movement is we can let people interact, but then we have to aggregate in some way, right? Like add it all up, take a mean, to a team level kind of construct, right? In which case what we do is we eliminate we homogenize, right? We eliminate all kinds of heterogeneity among individuals. We start talking about them as if they were a unit and there was no disagreement. And we also eliminate all interaction among people, right? We normally say this is the average group, the mean group attitude leads to the mean group behavior. Okay. So McGrath, Arrow, and Berdahl, who you should of course recognize as a group who studies group dynamics and are interested in this whole complex systems kind of approach, repeated. This is now 2000. We have a problem group dynamics with just group statics. Also, we have single level cause and effect. Okay, and the single level could be the micro level or the macro level, right? But either we aggregate everything or we have just individuals acting. Okay, and finally, that we do this without context. And I think you could probably walk around an in-group conference every year and you'd find, you could interview everyone there and they would all agree with this as a problem. And then we'd all turn around and do studies that are consistent with all of these things, right? So we've had many, many calls. You can see I have from 2000 to 2016 where people are talking about the idea of emergence and saying we need to do multi-level research and we need to pay more attention to dynamics. The funny part is some of those articles about saying we need multi-level research sound suspiciously like the old statistical, it's the same old, it's just now we have HLM, we'll just control away statistically for the team level effects, right? But it's still sort of single level kind of work. But there's a much desire and many people talking about emergence. But I will tell you that I think that there's a great deal of confusion even in these articles, okay? So, people in the teams area still talk a lot about what has emerged rather than how, okay? What I mean by that, people will say, we're going to focus on emergent states, okay? And you see that in Marx, Matthew, and Zakara, you see this in Waller and O'Keeson's, they all talk about emergent states. Now, what intrigues me about that is emergent states are what we've been studying all along. We just didn't call them emergent before, okay? What I mean, this is the outcome of people interacting, that there's some group level phenomenon, group team climate or team trust or something. And so for us to focus on that and start using the word emergent, I would say nothing's been gained and nothing's changed, okay? That we've always been studying what's emergent. Just because we use this new language and we talk about novelty and emergence and qualitative changes, but it's what we've studied all along. There's really no difference in doing this. Secondly, there's lots of use of variance ideas, which I will argue don't apply at all in emergence, still in all this literature. So processes are still mediators, okay? And bear with me if that seems like they should be mediators, okay? But they're somehow mediating between inputs and outputs. They're sort of mediating between levels, okay? But I'm going to argue mediation is completely inappropriate once we abandon our variance kinds of studies and actually look at emergence. Then we look at only the variable-like properties of emergence. For example, it is true that things that are state-like, meaning the team climate, can emerge in teams, but also certain patterns of behavior can emerge, and certain structures, okay, can emerge. But those aren't very amenable to the kind of variance type of ideas that we have, right? So we don't see people talking about patterns as mediators. That's just shifting thinking styles, and we're not doing it yet. And you'll also see, especially in the research with like Kozlowski and Klein and Kozlowski and Chow, lots of confounding with measurement issues. So there's still lots of talk about convergence and divergence. And it's weird because those things can mean several things. In static work, convergence means we're converging around a mean, that we basically agree that there's consensus. And in a dynamic environment, though, convergence might mean we are converging on the mean, meaning it's a process over time, as opposed to a static measurement, right? It's a process over time. But it can I also tell you, it's a very, I would say that I've got many models and I've looked at lots of team processes and I almost never see consensus, okay, or complete divergence, right? You might see groups of people moving in different directions, you see change over time. So it's not that these things can't be true, but they're very constricting, right? And so they seem to be, we're trying to pull some things we think we're familiar with and apply them in the emergence land in a way that doesn't seem quite comfortable or reflecting real deep understanding yet. And again, just as in the microfoundations debate, you see, what are these units and levels, okay? And they get quite lost. And I know I'm being very abstract, but I'll move on. I hope to give you some examples that will help this become more clear. Oh, but by the way, I would say, I also see in this literature all kinds of claims I find really difficult. Like, by the way, most of the people are my friends, so I think I can pick on them and they'll give me permission eventually. So Waller and O'Keefe in a paper that just came out talk about, say, importantly, emergent phenomena are distinct from the process or mechanism of emergence itself. And I'll say more about this, but I'll tell you, absolutely not. Absolutely not. They're the same thing. But these are variance ideas, right? That one level causes the next level, okay? In strong emergence, there is downward causality. I'm not sure why there isn't in weak, but I don't think there is strong and weak emergence. I studied nothing but emergence and have no idea what they're talking about. But this downward causality idea is very tricky, and I'll say more too. It's like somehow the patterns make people do things, right? Or the team climate or feeling makes people do things. This is actually very tricky when we get closer to it. And then I'm going to pick on Humphrey and Aim, but there's probably 2 or 3 folks I could pick on. Everyone has their own version of what emerges. There's whole different categories. And Matt Cronin has this list of one, and Kozlowski and Klein have a list of another, and Humphrey and Aim. And I was reading them the other day, and they're talking about emergent longitudinal theory, emergent vertical theory, dual emergent theorizing. My head spins when I try to understand it. But it turns out some of those are dynamic, and some are static, and some are cross-sectional. It's very difficult to unwind, and I would say it's nothing but confusion, okay? They don't, actually, most of those things aren't emergent at all, okay? But we're trying to bring together all these different things that we know in all our past approaches and trying to categorize them and throw them all in this big tent called emergence. And I think that we'd actually be served by not putting them all in the same tent, to see their commonalities but not pull them together. And this is Fulmer and Ostroff, a paper that just came out recently in JOB, and they're talking about convergence. They're studying, this is directly from Kozlowski and Klein, their understanding about this convergence business. So they actually say that factors leading to convergence as emergent properties can only have effects to the degree that there's some coalescence among the lower level elements. Now that may seem really weird, but what they're trying to say, this is just, if you go back to your statistics kind of thinking, that they have to agree, there can't be much variance around the mean, and that's how we know that it's emerged. And I would say that idea is right from variance thinking and statistics and has no bearing whatsoever on emergence or any kind of group that you've actually seen. Why should everybody agree? Why should we all coalesce around the mean? And who says we couldn't coalesce and then uncoalesce and start disagreeing, right? If we think of real groups and how they behave, or real organizations, I'm not sure that that makes sense at all, okay? But as I said, there's this, like, we're hanging on to our variance thinking. Okay, so I think this is the question, right? And in the last article, most recent article in the Microfoundations debate, Phelan, Foss, and Floydhart, this is an Academy of Management Annals, a review of this whole Microfoundations business, or at least all the things that they haven't abandoned, right? Said the notion of emergence is vague. And I would say I agree to them that it is quite vague. And Kozlowski, Chow, and colleagues as recently as 2017 also says org science has a relatively limited knowledge of emergence, and some basic expertise has to be acquired. And I agree most certainly, given what I've read in those other articles. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to talk to you about today is, so if emergence is the solution to all these problems that we have in studying multi-level phenomena, or studying dynamic phenomena, or putting phenomena in context, how does that work? Okay. And so first I'm going to suggest this to you, and I'm going to help unwind these things. But one of the problems is we don't distinguish between emerging we use this word emergence, and it's never quite clear what we're talking about. Like, is emergence the process of emerging? Is it the thing that emerges, the emergent outcome? Or I would like to argue there's even something separate from those two called the properties of the outcomes that emerge, okay? And that's really important to say which one of these that you're talking about, and not just to lump it all together as emergence. Next, I will argue that there are multiple components of emerging. So if we're talking about emerging, the process of or the dynamics of, that there are many components and you can't ignore them, right? And this goes back to the issue of just individual psychology or not, okay? People don't know what emergence implies, and I'm going to go through that. And in particular, these two big ideas, which I'll talk about, which is holism. Okay, what does it mean for a whole to exist? And there's some ideas around synchronicity, which I think will actually help make things clear. And then, of course, levels and units are completely confused. And I'll say that because I'll say levels and units simply don't have the same meaning that they do in variance kind of studies, or have micro and macro. Okay, so to clarify, I thought I'd better start with emergent processes, okay? First, I would say to have emergent processes, you have to have dynamic interactions, and they're connected over time. And I say connected over time because I'm thinking that like longitudinal studies are not studies of emergence. When I mean longitudinal, I mean in the sense of a series of static measures at distant points in time, okay? Now, it doesn't mean that we can't tap into emergent outcomes, okay, by looking at something longitudinally. We can, but we won't know anything about how they emerged, right? I mean, we could theorize it, and then we could say our correlations are consistent with it, but it's not the same thing as studying emerging, okay? And then emergent processes also have to occur among interdependent agents. And not just interdependent agents, but I'll say more about what else in just a second, okay? But if there's no interdependence, you don't pursue emergence. If people are independent, statistics are great. All those independent actions and observations, you can make a lot of sense of them. Now, emergent outcomes are a trickier thing. I'm from business school, so I'll say they're work products, right? But meaning, but you know, there are lots of other things that can come out. But meaning, if you have a team and they're working together, the outcomes are actually, I would not say that team climate is an outcome. I want to make a distinction. But the products mean what they produce as a team is their outcome. In a routine, the outcomes of the routine are emergent outcomes. And I'm trying to make this distinction because people talk vaguely. Sometimes we talk about outcomes, sometimes we talk about phenomena. In our variance type studies, we tend to say outcomes and inputs are the same thing. There's an input, a process, there's an outcome, which is the input to the next thing. But if we're talking about the input to the next thing, we're not saying if I produce a bunch of widgets, the widgets are the next thing I put back into the group. We don't mean that at all. Okay? So if emergent outcomes are things like what the routine produces or the people produces, then of course it begs the question, so what is the team climate and those things? And I would tell you those are emergent properties. Those are properties of this group interacting, okay? Or it's a property of the routine, which is also people acting. And this is where we get to this idea of emergence, that there's a qualitative change. So, for example, I may have an attitude, right? That's a nice word we use about students all the time. They've got a bad attitude, right? But people in a work group, right? People may have different attitudes about it, but the group's attitude as a whole may not be, you may not be able to predict it by looking at the individuals. Almost surely asking the individuals, how do you feel today, might not tell you anything about the team climate, right? But there's a real qualitative change, okay? Now, examples of emergent properties, and I want to give credit to my friends who I criticized a moment before, right? But what they do have, right, and what is missing in so many earlier articles is there tends to be a focus only on states, as I said, that are variable-like. But in fact, emergent properties can be states, right? Some feature of the collective, right? So in teams work, we often talk about things like the feeling of the group, right? But in routines, it's like the routine, meaning the pattern of behavior, is actually an emergent outcome, right? So patterns themselves can also be an emergent property of people interacting. And finally, there's structures, which also can emerge in the dynamic behavior of people. Okay. Now, I want to say more about emerging, okay? And I'll show you why in a second, because one of the things I'm trying to do is distinguish this from other methods, okay? First of all, emerging is about aggregation. So in variable studies, we say we take the mean or something, we add it up, right? We add up people's behavior. So we just pre-assume, right, this is how this aggregates. Some studies, very rare, but some are more sophisticated, and they say maybe the variance matters, or maybe I need a weighted mean, right? But we assume these, and we use these to total something up to get to the next level. But the study of emergence is fundamentally the study of aggregation. Literally exactly how does that aggregate, not this sort of general, I'm going to assume the mean. But we're asking the question, how does it aggregate? And how does it aggregate dynamically? I tried to explain to people when I was a doctoral student, I said, I had only my corporate experience, right? And my original research question was, how come you get a group of really smart people together and they do such stupid things? It wasn't a sophisticated question, but it was deeply rooted in my life experience, okay, working, as a consultant with top management teams, right? And trust me, they were hiring consultants because they were really screwed up, right? So, and the point of dynamics, though, is you have to be able to look at this question. How does what I do affect what you do, which affects what you do, which affects what I do, right? How does this interdependence and interaction, that is actually the process of aggregation, okay? And it's cross-level, but I put quotation marks around that because I only mean that in a variance sense. I'm actually going to argue there aren't any levels in the emergence world, okay? But it's cross-level, meaning it has to include the people and probably their attitudes and their decisions and their behaviors. And those create the whole. Okay, but now I'm going to talk to you about features of emerging because these are highly neglected in our talk about emergence. So first, agents interacting with other agents. I think most people have gotten that idea, right? So in the Microfoundations, the idea that people interacting with others might equal a routine. People are clear about that. And the same thing in group dynamics. What people are less clear about is you also have to include everything else agents interact with. Okay? The structures, technology, and the context. Okay? You simply aren't studying emergence if you're not including those things in the study. Now, you also have to include the mode of organizing, and I mean this in two ways, which is there's a structure of interdependence. For all of you involved in social network analysis, what I'm saying is, if you don't define that network, you cannot study emergence, okay? But I would say you don't just need social networks. I study teams, for example, and sometimes what matters is team boundaries. Are you inside the team or are you outside the team? Is there one team or more teams? Teams could make decisions, everyone deciding at the same time, right? Or there could be a chain that might not be built on dyads. But it matters. You simply, I know this is some of the things I've learned from building agent-based models. I cannot model how something emerges without deciding how do they interact, who do they relate to, who goes first, and that was the second one, the mode of timing. Who goes first, who goes second, who doesn't go at all, right? Whatever go means, whatever the subject is. But one of my arguments here is you are not studying emergence if you are not including those things. And people are stuck back in the variance world when they think that I can take individual attitudes. And if you go back and read the Microfoundations debate, at least the beginnings of it, this is exactly how it works. We just knew what individuals' attitudes, preferences, we would understand routines. And I would say, well, that might be helpful, okay? But you need a whole lot more. You actually have to know all these other things to explain how something emerges. Okay? And then I want to make what I think is one of the most important insights I can share today, and I will say more about this too, but is the components of emerging, and these are all these components. People interacting with other people, with structures, with technology, in certain patterns, right? With certain relationships, with different timing, constitute emergent outcomes and properties, and don't cause them. And I will say more about this, but I was going to say this is one of the most fundamental things you have to understand if you're going to understand emergence, okay? And the things that is most often confused. So importing from variance thinking, people will still say there's something about individuals that causes this group property to emerge. And what I'll say is, no. The individuals thinking what they do, doing what they do, interacting with each other, is the pattern of behavior, okay? It is the emerging, and it is the emergent, and it is the property, okay? And what's weird is if you're too well trained, and hopefully some of you are earlier in your doctoral career and you're not as well trained, this might be clearer to you. What I find is the more senior people are, the harder this is to do because you have to unwind everything you've been trained and you have to go back to the real world, right? And people in the real world, I don't think have as much trouble with that, which is like, yeah, what we all do together, that is the thing. You know, like that is, we have an outcome, meaning I produce some widgets perhaps, you know, a service or a thing, but what we do is the team client. Constant, it doesn't cause it, it is it. Okay? Now bear with me because I'll give you some examples I think that will help with that. I have this slide which I change it about weekly and I need more changes again, but what I'm trying to do here is sort of back out from how we've been trained. So this is, I'm trying to do a picture of like longitudinal, we have this micro level variable, we try to aggregate it to something macro, and we may even have a thing in between. People are confused, they think these are processes, like this mediator, right? Something's mediating, the social mechanism. But the social mechanism is, let's say I'll use some communication, that's a popular one, right? It's like, let's have communication. Of course, this isn't a process at all, right? This is a variable. You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well did you communicate, right? It isn't a process. And so this is our typical statistical attempts to look at the emergent variable. I call it variable, and I didn't use the word emergent, but if you back down from the articles people are writing these days, they're still back to looking at that variable, and now they just call it the emergent variable, the emergent macro thing, right? The team climate up there, or how much team trust we have, and they're trying to predict it from these things, and maybe even doing it longitudinally, okay? And I would say this is not a study of emergence, okay? Now we have people doing things like this. I'm going to look at a series of events, right, that I can observe in the world, and I'm going to look at the correlations over time, okay? Well, I would argue that those events are emergent, right? They are all these people interacting. That is what the event is, right? But it's not the study of emergence, because it leaves out, it neglects emerging, right? And we can learn from these things, right? So these are, you'll see the problem with it, these are all at the same level. And by the way, this is really at the same level too, despite my drawing, because we have to figure out how to aggregate that, right? To sum it up. Finally, this is a picture really of system dynamics kind of study. And this, people in system dynamics keep saying this is emergence, okay? And I find that that's, while it's a very useful kind of study, it's not emergence in the sense of, it's not studying aggregating, right? It's not studying how does it work, meaning we assume the relationships between these variables. And it also isn't cross-level, okay? Although some people in system dynamics say it is cross-level, but what they're just doing the same thing we do over here, which is you just sum up a variable. Maybe it's a cumulative variable, right? It's a stock, you're adding things, right? And it leads to some kind of emergent variable. So we're still in the world of variables here, and we're still at the single level. So all of these are really interesting. They help us understand change over time. We can either learn about correlation, we can say we have a patterning theory, but it's not about emergence, because emergence is really theories about how this thing aggregates. And it's a testing if the things aggregate that way, or explaining how they do aggregate, okay? Including all these components. Are you with me? Is this all? Okay, all right. Okay, so what's not explained yet is units and levels and components and how nonlinearity occurs, okay? And I'm taking a stab at those today, okay? I'm just doing a time check because the clock still says it's 10 to 9, right? Okay. So I have a lot of points, and I'm not going to make them all, and my doctoral students tell me that I give talks that are idea-rich, they said. That means I jam too much into them, okay? They're very kind to me, though. But I have just a few points, and they're kind of front-loaded, so if I don't get to the last ones, it's fine. But so I want to talk about a few things. The first one is this, which is, this is the problem in the microfoundations debate, is this idea that we should be looking at people as opposed to routines. Their initial argument that collectivism is wrong, methodological individualism is the right way. What that means is they don't understand there's really a qualitative change between what individuals are thinking or the traits or beliefs they have and what happens at the upper level. If there's a qualitative change, then it is completely legitimate to separately study the thing at the top, okay? Right? You can only understand them holistically. And I give an example. I'll start with water, and it's kind of cheap for me to go to physical sciences, but I think things are so much clearer, and then I can give you some examples from social science where things are always murkier, okay? But for example, you can study molecules, H2O molecules, all you want, okay? And this probably goes back to our 4th or 5th grade science, right? We know that they can be negatively, positively charged, and they stick together, and you can learn all about them. And what you will not understand is the properties of water, which are, it's fluid, it's transparent, it's the universal solvent, because none of those are properties of an H2O molecule. They are properties of interactions of H2O molecules. And this is what emergence is about, is when you get H2O molecules interacting, all of a sudden you get all these properties, and they don't exist. And this is the argument we're making. So of course it's legitimate to study water, okay? And it's legitimate to study H2O molecules, but you're not learning the same things, right? These are considered different levels of science, and it matters, okay? And they're both legitimate, okay? But they have a different purpose. And it's easier to lose track of that in social science. But for example, organizational routines, you can't just study individuals and their habits. Although it's a little discouraging, Sid Winter, who I have the utmost respect for, is back to talking about Dewey and habits. And he makes me a little nervous, okay? Because it's not that routines, there can't be some correlation of individuals doing habitual things and routines. But if you really think about routines, and I must say I was a manager for a long time, you desperately need people not doing routine things, right? So you do something routine, but you're off by a few minutes, the other person better adjust, right? And routines, in fact, stable routines are all about constant adjustment, right? Someone calls in sick, someone always calls in sick, especially if you have people working at minimum wage with very little support, right? Routines actually are all about constant readjustment, right? So in fact, we might have exactly the wrong thing that we're measuring at the individual level to study at this higher level, okay? Team climate's not a property of the individual members of the group, okay? And I'm not saying that how people feel every day in the group doesn't matter, right? I think that it does, right? But that might not help me understand the team climate, right? Now, and of course, well, and we'll get back to that, right? And this is a whole other area, I guess I felt the need to throw that in. Like consciousness has been a very difficult thing to study. Because we keep looking at the brain, or which parts of the brain light up in an fMRI, we can't get there. But it's this holism challenge, okay? The second that I've been, that really drove me nuts, I think, in reading the Microfoundations stuff, is that, in fact, there's probably a diminished role for human psychology and agency in our theories, okay, if you really understand emergence. And remember I'm the OB person here, I'm not even a strategy or an OT person, right? I'm an OB person. I really, well, okay, teams, maybe I am more as a level, right? But I'm not saying psychology and agency don't matter. But what is, if you actually include in your theories, it's not enough to just have a box narrow diagram with some psychological variable in the input or predictor boxes, right? If you actually have a theory with all of these components in it, what you often find is that these other things overwhelm the psychology issues, okay? So the individual agents or the mean average motives may have little effect on emergent outcomes. An example I give, are people familiar with Schelling's? Everybody here? Okay. Some nod, some not. Okay, but the quick view is Schelling wanted to explain how come people say they're not very biased or prejudiced, and yet people live in almost entirely segregated neighborhoods. And by the way, Chicago was what he was studying, but there are lots of other cities in the US that map to this exactly, right? And for years, sociologists would interview people, and people would, well, you know, like some people around me, because I like to be near my religious institution, or I can get some food that I like, or I can get my hair done, or my hair puffed. You're like, yeah, of course. But, you know, I'm cool when people are different from me. It's okay, right? And so sociologists had to, like, wow, why are they saying this? We're doing this. And there's lots of, well, there's socially acceptable answers. They're just telling us this. Obviously, they're really biased, okay? But Schelling made huge headway by building models of this, and he actually showed if you place people randomly in an area, okay? Now, if people actually don't care at all who they live with, this random configuration is actually the ending point and the starting point, right? But it turns out at fairly modest levels of preference to be with people like ourselves, you end up with completely segregated neighborhoods, okay? But the point I want to make here is, if you look at in the center of these neighborhoods, and these are red peoples and green peoples, right, living in our households, right? If you look at the people in the middle here, there's no correlation between their preferences and where they live. If you study how this model works. People who want to have everyone like them stay there, but people who are content with, say, 10% of their neighbors like them, well, they stay too, okay? And then there's more correlation at the fringes, okay? But the point is, psychology is now, you can see, isn't doing much of the explanation. It's not accounting for much of what happens here. So that's my second problem, right? Which is, it turns out structure matters a lot, as does timing, who moves first, who does what when. I said, and Nosh here, and I'm sure many of you work on social networks, this must be very heartening in a way, right? But we know, it turns out that structure matters, right? The structure of, or who talks to who relates to who, interacts with who, and who does it first, second, who's quiet, who talks a lot and never says a thing, right? It affects, and it might very well overwhelm psychology in our explanations, okay? Okay, the third point here, and this is where I said I want to get back to this idea of constitution is stunningly important and most misunderstood. But it turns out that all of these things, interacting, not just interdependent agents, but interacting interdependent agent structures, technology, and context, compromise the macro phenomenon. Don't cause it, they are it. Okay. Okay, so what happens is, these are not different levels of analysis, right? To study what the quarterback is doing, I can study what the quarterback is doing. But what the quarterback is doing, if you watch football, I like football, right? Is just, you know you can have the best quarterback in the world, and if you have the worst receivers in the world, they do not score. Well, okay, unless your quarterback can run, but that's a whole other thing, right? The point is, you can't just look at one person in the team, and they're not meaningful in the team. You need to look at the whole team. And the whole team doing what the whole team does is the phenomena. And it is the properties. And that sounds like a logical leap, okay? But I will say more. But the point is, the whole is co-occurring with the parts and the property. And of course, properties include states, patterns, structures, all of those things. They're all part of this. Okay. And again, I retreat to my physical example, but because I think it's easier to see, right? H2O molecules interacting don't cause water. So I think that's easier. You're right, they don't cause water, they are water. Okay? As I said in the physical example, it's really clear in a way that sometimes in the social ones we get confused with what I'm thinking at the time or what I perceive and separating that. But so the H2O molecules are interacting, okay. So people engaging in a workplace routine don't cause the routine or the pattern. Their actions are, they comprise the routine and the patterns that arise from it, okay? And same thing, team trust is people trusting each other to varying degrees. It isn't the mean of the perceived team trust, right? It's not, okay. Now, I gave this might seem like a silly example. It took me a long time trying to find an image that might convey this, right? But the idea is, these women and the water that they're swimming in and the structure create this star formation, okay? And what's interesting is that it depends on, I would bet that we can say there are different types of stars. Some parts are connected and some aren't, right? But we can also, I bet you if I could put this, I looked for a GIF for a while, but then I gave up, right? We probably caught them in a movement like this, right? That this thing is actually changing. But what they're doing constitutes the starness of this shape, right? Okay? And the existence of the shape, right? They're all one thing, okay? So interdependent parts interacting are this outcome that we're talking about, and they are the pattern as well. And if you're not convinced, one way to think about it is this, is to have causality, you have to have separation in time. One thing has to occur before the other, okay? And so if you think about these things, what you'll see is they're all synchronous, meaning the properties are synchronous with the acting. And that's part of the evidence that they're not causal, that they're constituting. Okay. And then, and I must tell you, I can't tell you how much time I've thought about this, and I'd be interested in your thoughts too, but I don't think there is any downward causation at all. And this is very difficult, I think, to wrap your mind around and for people to understand. But this is the idea that the patterns don't cause people to behave, okay? And this is very difficult for us to unwind because we have this sort of this box and arrow mentality. And people would say it's a pattern from last time's step that caused my behavior this time's step, okay? But I think that this is not right, that causality can only occur, and this is actually consistent with stats. You have causality at a macro level and you have causality at a micro level, but you don't have how we behave right now doesn't have that same relationship. Let's go to my example. Okay, so I pulled, here's something from Marx, Matthew, and Zaccaro, and I'm sorry I don't have the date on that, but it's not so long ago. And they said, for example, emergent states can be considered both team inputs and proximal outcomes. For example, teams with low cohesion, right, in their emergent state, may be less willing to manage existing conflict, which is the process, which they think are different, okay? Which in turn may create additional conflict that lowers cohesion levels even further. And you look at that and you're like, okay, it seems to follow logically. But I said you could say, and I think much more accurately, members of teams with low cohesion may be less willing to manage conflict, which in turn may lead them to create additional conflict that lowers their perception of cohesion. What I'm trying to say is, it's not the team cohesion out there in the world like a separate variable causes something. It's people perceiving it, right? So it's individuals who are parts of this thing, who are this emerging thing, that are perceiving, which is part of what is going on in this emergent process. And it's their perceptions of this pattern that change their behavior, okay? And what I'm trying to say is, it's not that patterns don't affect, but patterns don't have a separate existence out there, separately, so that they've been caused and they exist out in the world. And I would note further, because I study teams a lot, that members of the team probably don't converge in their view of the pattern, right? So different people who are all part of this big thing, this emerging process, are perceiving different things about the pattern, and they're judging them differently. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. So I'm going to have to zip right through these, but I'll tell you. So emergent outcomes, one of the things that's important here is that they're many layered, but the layers aren't necessarily where you think they are, okay? That what matters here is each layer is one that's emergent at the lower level. Like, we can't get beneath it without studying that emergent property below. And that's why there's been some argument in science, but the idea is this is actually a joke, okay? That in fact, one thing is not just applied to something else. If this is the reductionist argument you saw at the beginning, everything is not molecules. Okay, we shouldn't all quit our jobs and become physicists, okay? Because of emergence, right? Upwards emergence. There are different properties at each level. So every level of science is legitimate and has its own laws that need to be understood. Now, of course, we as people with our patterns of behavior and our psychology are fully constrained by our chemistry, which is constrained by our physics, right? So we're not denying the lower levels. We're just saying the lower levels don't explain them. Okay, and it gets to this issue of stopping point. Why stop at individuals? Which in Microfoundations, that was the question. To study routines, why stop at individuals? But it's even worse than that, because those of us, especially in OB, who read these things say, what do you mean individuals? Individual actions? Because that's at a higher level of emergence than individual attitudes, right? Which is at a higher level than the things I'm learning in my fMRI studies, right, about biology, that there's emergence at every level, and they all are legitimate. And you can't skip levels. You can find correlations across many levels. Okay. Okay, so then the next one is, and this I don't think is worth stressing very much, but Phelan and Foss were obsessed with the idea that macro things cannot cause macro things, that you have to explain by going to micro levels. And who would say that's absurd, okay? And the simple example from water is simply solidity, which is a property of a rock, the interacting molecules of a rock. Solidity does interact with fluidity, right? You drop a rock in the water and it will cause ripples, and this is macro to macro causation, okay? But of course all the other physics is there, and it's all there, okay? But there can be causation there. But this I think is important, is you cannot have a theory of emerging without looking at all the parts, okay? And that you need to understand processes to have a theory of emerging, and this is what we're lacking when we talk about multi-level research. We don't necessarily need more statistical methods to control for upper or lower levels. What we need to do is develop theories of emerging, and I would offer to you, let's see, what are my examples? Okay. Probably the best example that most people can understand of what a theory of emerging would look like is the theory of natural selection, okay? Because, and by this way, I presented this a while ago at my school, and I had a fellow there who, he said, so this predicts. I said, well, actually most theories of emergence don't predict. And he pretty much stormed out, not exactly, we're friends, but he's like, this is ridiculous, right? What do you mean? What use is this if a theory doesn't predict? What we mean by this, it doesn't predict outcomes. So for example, Darwin's theory of natural selection did not tell us what species we would have 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, okay? I'm not saying it can't. If we understand enough about genes and exactly which one's going to sort of which way, it could. People have been breeding animals for years with a general understanding of this, right? But the point is, in general, theories of emerging are theories like this. It's a theory about how the process works. And Darwin's theory actually suggested that genes exist. They didn't know that genes existed, but something like genes would have to exist to carry the information forward. Okay? And this is what theories of emerging look like, is they tend to describe processes and acknowledge that there can be various outcomes, right, which are unpredictable, right? Meaning, by which, not saying, I would say they were predictable if you knew every part of the process, right? But in general, act in sort of probabilistic ways or patterned ways, okay? We have a theory. I thought about it quite a bit. There aren't many theories when I think about teamwork that are these kinds of theories, but the idea of transactive memory is this kind of theory. Because it doesn't actually say this is what you're going to know or this is how a team is going to work. It talks about how people sort knowledge, right? And how people, as a team, remember what's going on and reach out to others when they work. So this is exactly an example. And it's a very powerful and strong idea in the study of groups, okay? Although it's not predictive in that sense of predicting outcomes, right? And Shelley's propositions about segregation are the same thing, right? It's a description of how it works and why it works. Okay, so unwinding the levels and units, I'd say, in order to do this kind of thinking and to think about emergence, we have to abandon variables. There aren't any units per se, right? Because there are no variables. We're not, if you can, I guess you could call a state a variable if you want, but pretty much we have no variables anymore. And we don't have units. What we have is, I'll say people acting because I studied teams, but you could have firms acting, right? And you could have other other actors, okay, or other locations of agency. Okay? But so you have, as I'll say in my role, people doing things, you know, like you see every day and you actually understand in your real life, but doesn't translate very well to our kind of variance world. All emerging processes combine interdependent agents and context into a larger but not independent entity, right? Meaning the people in a group, it's not, I can't say the individuals since say they cause the group, right? It's the individuals interacting that constitute this different unit, okay? A variance level isn't the same as an emergent level, right? Levels, I don't know about this point, but levels of emergence can be defined in the context of each problem. I put there on a day I wasn't feeling very good about my level story, right? But what I'm trying to say is I think a lower level is where something's emerged, right? And so even the idea in agent-based modeling that we use simple rules, I don't know that the world is run by simple rules. I would say that a simple rule is the way to capture the emergent phenomenon, say, of the decision process. Right? It's a simplified way of specifying the lower level emergent thing, so I only have to treat one emerging process at a time. And any phenomenon can contain multiple levels of the hierarchy of science, by which I mean this. In my models, it's not just people, I act and you act, and we create an acting sort of emergent thing. I would actually say that sometimes I decide and I act, and then you do something, and then changes what I decide, and what I did changed what you decided, right? So you could actually go many levels down in this hierarchy of science, right? Or it makes me feel something, it makes me decide something, it makes me act something, that those all could be in a system that I model and care about. So levels has changed its meaning. So unwinding aggregation, again, I just want to say the order of actions matter, the order of decisions and reaction matters, and technology matters, and I probably said less about that, right? But meaning we interact with, it's like everyone can't hear me in this building right now. There are walls, right? We can only reach so many people. All those things matter, right? Is the famous routine study about towels. Do I leave them on the floor? Do I leave them on a hook? To send a message about whether you should wash them or not, right? The hook is technology, right? There are actually constraints that enable or remove things, and they matter. You can't have a theory without those things in them. So for me, I want to say this is a new kind of reductionism in which we reduce not just to say component parts like attitudes or individuals, but we reduce to all these fundamentals, okay? Structure, technology, timing, right? As well as say attitudes or perceptions, that they must be in every theory. But that I still think it's a form of reductionism, meaning I don't build models of the world, I build simplified models of the world, right? So it is still reductionism, but I'm reducing to different parts. So to do this thing, we have to let go of our need to predict, right? To predict outcomes. In the words of Waller and O'Keefe, we need to propose models that do not pre-specify, but they detect particular aggregation configurations. We need to clarify our thinking about the distinction between dynamic phenomena and their properties, and embrace recursiveness. What I mean is, forget this longitudinal stuff. Literally, how does what I do change what you do changes what I do, right? That we have to look at every step of the way to really understand what emerges. And so for myself, I will say that I'm working on a paper on the elements of emerging with one of my doctoral students, in which I'm trying to show two things. One, that in every agent-based model type study that you've seen, they have all the elements I'm talking about. And now we're working our way through some qualitative papers, and I will show you they have every element that I'm talking about. That you can't tell those stories of process without all of those elements. It just, you can't explain what's happening.
Great. On the dot. Thank you. So I know that we are way behind in time and there's a class waiting outside that's going to want to walk in here. So I know that many of you have scheduled meetings and lunches and so on with speakers. So I'm really glad that we got lots of things started early in the morning to talk about during the rest of the day, etc. And as a token of our appreciation, Corinne, this is something that we give all our sonic speakers, a pen, the old-fashioned low-technology approach.
I love it. I'm from the olden days.
There we go. Okay, well, I'm going to have to rush off because I have to teach. There's a class here. I have to teach a class in the garage that starts in 2 minutes. But I hope the rest of you have a good chance to continue to chat with Corinne for the rest of the day. Thanks.
And I'm happy to forward my slides, and I have cards if anyone just wants to email later if I'm not talking to you later. But thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you.
I'll take those slides. Okay. Keep looking at my
Because I've gotten back to before.
You want to just email?
You might have.
Write down a little word there. Maybe you can email. Does it work, or you would not?
Well, yeah, no, I didn't like we need it out.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, now I'm going to throw this away now.